Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for coming. So the Endangered Species Act is one of the premier elements of environmental legislation in the United States. It currently protects over 1,600 different taxa nationwide, and the number of taxa continues to grow relatively steadily every year. So as you can see, each year there's a wide variance in the number of taxa that get listed, but on average it's a few dozen per year. And the cumulative listing curve shows no sign of reaching an asymptote yet. And so this Endangered Species Act and a listing of additional species is going to continue to orchestrate significant changes to species-specific conservation policy nationwide. And so for this reason, I think it's still a very important aspect of conservation policy in the United States. And so there are, however, a number of challenges associated with the listing process for new species with respect to the Endangered Species Act. And one of these challenges is what's called the Mega-petition. And what these are petitions to list new species that involve dozens, sometimes up to hundreds of additional species that are all consolidated together in a single document. And that consolidation is based off of one of several possible factors. So those can include things like evolutionary relatedness among the taxa, shared life history traits, or shared habitat types. And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is the federal agency that sort of officiates the listing of new species for both terrestrial and freshwater species in the U.S. In the early 1990s, they actually first promoted this method of proposing new species as a way to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the proposal process, because by lumping a number of different species with those shared characters, you could sort of create a more streamlined listing process for groups of species. And so that paradigm came to dominate the listing landscape, if you will. And so these are just a few examples of mega-petitions that have been submitted over the last few years. Interestingly, this past fall, the Fish and Wildlife Service actually completely reversed their position on these mega-petition frameworks and actually banned them. Restrict in the future only one species per petition from now on. And they justified that decision on the basis of several factors. So one being a general lack of very specific species-oriented information on a per-species basis within these petitions. So they're often dominated by very broad scope information and very little information relating to the actual conservation status or threats associated with the individual species. And somewhat predictably, and so this is the Federal Register notice announcing that regulatory ban. And rather predictably, so that created a little bit of outrage among certain organizations for whom these mega-petitions were something that they really relied upon as part of their mission statement, if you will. And certainly there is a little bit of, make sure I get my pointer here. There's a little bit of truth to the fact that these were, this decision was not well supported in the peer-reviewed literature. So this was just sort of general statements made by the Fish and Wildlife Service in their justification for this ban. And so this sort of brings me to where I sort of fit into this, and sort of the purpose of this presentation is to provide an empirical case study, sort of trying to look at whether or not these statements made by the Fish and Wildlife Service in justifying this ban are in fact supported by evidence with respect to these petitions. And so I'm going to focus on this petition in particular, which was submitted in 2012 and proposed to list 53 individual taxa of reptiles and amphibians across the United States. And in particular, I'm going to focus on two species that were included in this petition. And so these two are the Panamint alligator lizard and the Inyo Mountains salamander. Excuse me. And so as you can see, these are roughly co-distributed species that occupy isolated mountain ranges in eastern California, in the northern Mojave Desert and Great Basin deserts. And so they share a lot of life history traits. However, they're quite different in some areas. Yet they share generally sort of the same threats, as we'll see in a bit. And they're useful for me personally because I sort of have a lot of experience working with these over the last few years as part of my dissertation. And so to evaluate how accurate the mega-petition actually was in terms of the language that they used for sort of creating the need or advocating the need for listing these animals. What I did was I exhaustively reviewed the white and gray literature that's associated with both of these animals and supplemented that with field data that's largely unpublished, that's been collected over the last 15 years by myself, most recently, and a few collaborators early in the 2000s. And so some of the results to come out of that literature review are as follows, and sort of these are some of the key results that sort of illustrate that dichotomy between what the reality is on the ground with respect to these animals and what was promulgated in the Mega-petition. And so first is this fact that both of these species, to the best of our knowledge, only occur on federally managed lands. So there is no private land that is either known or expected to support either of these species. And so that has a direct relation to their threat status, obviously, because if you're not having a species that occurs on private land, there's less of a risk that that land's going to be developed or modified in a way that's going to be harmful to those species. Despite this fact, in the petition for both species, they actually state that most of the localities for the lizard were actually on private land. This is based on a highly outdated source that most people who study the lizard recognize now to be completely false and was actually never true and is probably, in fact, just based on a typo where they meant to say most of the localities were on public land instead of private land. So a real dichotomy there in terms of sort of the realities on the ground versus what the petition was advocating. Other interesting dichotomies are the fact that there is no scientific evidence to indicate any extirpations of any populations of either species. There's no scientific evidence to indicate that any population has or is currently undergoing a decline. And there's no evidence of major habitat loss at any population that is currently known to be occupied for any of these species. And each one of those factors at the bottom, those are all things that were contradicted within the petition. In some cases, those contradictions were based on evidence that was either outdated or misinterpreted by the petitioners, or in some cases, they made statements that simply were not cited or backed up by evidence at all. And so where those opinions came from is an open question, but just sort of to emphasize that there's a lot of discrepancies between what the reality is for these critters and what the petition was actually proposing. Okay, so I want to transition now to an actual threat assessment, so looking at what specific factors are or could be affecting these species and leading to sort of potential declines or extirpations in the future. And so through the course of that literature review, through the threats that were identified in the petition, and through just sort of the field work that I and others have been doing over the past few years, we identified 12 discrete threats that we believe could at least potentially affect one or both of these species in the wild. And then we scored those threats according to how geographically widespread they were. And so that score ranges from 0 to 3, 0 indicating that the threat currently does not affect, to the best of our knowledge, any known populations, all the way up to a score of 3, which represents a threat that affects more than 50% of known populations of either species. And so what I want you to take away from this figure is just that, generally speaking, these threats are not geographically widespread. And in many cases, they are not currently affecting either of the species. So lots of zeros in the table there. And so this, again, sort of this reality is masked within the petition because many of these threats are promulgated as very severe in the petition to either or both of the species. And I'll just pull out two cases to just sort of highlight. So inadequate regulatory mechanisms, this is something that was really strongly emphasized in the petition. And so in fact, both of these species do have special status, either under California state law or under sort of protected species lists that are not the endangered species list, but protected species lists that sort of guide conservation and management by federal agencies. And so those listing statuses, which have been in place for dozens, if not over 25 years in some cases, those have motivated in the past few decades really directed, targeted management efforts by the federal agencies on whose lands these animals exist to mitigate a lot of these threats, in particular overgrazing, and road and off-highway vehicle use. And in some cases, those regulations, motivated by these existing regulatory measures, have actually eliminated those threats from certain populations. this is a fact that was not really recognized, in the petition per se, and was overlooked. Second one I'll just touch on briefly is mining. And so historically, this certainly was a threat to both species. But as early as the 1900s, it became quite clear that mining was on the decline in these regions. And today, I am personally unaware, and none of my collaborators are aware of any active mine within 2 miles of any known site for any of these species. And so the petition relied on those sort of outdated sources of past mining efforts and ongoing mining activity to promote mining as an ongoing threat to these species, when in fact that is not actually the case. Okay, and I can come back to this later if folks want to talk about any of those specific threats. So hopefully I've made somewhat of a case that this petition was not particularly accurate in terms of the threat assessment and conservation status that it promoted for these 2 species. But that brings me to sort of a broader question as well. Are these results indicative of a broader pattern within the petition, the mega-petition? Or are those results simply these outliers that don't necessarily indicate that these mega-petitions per se are a problem? And so to try and get at that question, I did 2 things. So first, I looked at the number of taxa that the Fish and Wildlife Service rejected at the very initial phase of the review process, which is called the 90-day review. And of those 53 species, 17 of them were automatically excluded from that first phase of the process, indicating that they probably were not appropriate for proposing as listing. Second thing I did was to look at taxa that were identified as having sort of problematic language during the public comment phase, which is the second phase of the listing process. And so this is when public comments from species authorities, or people who have published in the peer-reviewed literature on these species, can submit comments, and also state wildlife agencies. And so I took comments from those 2 sources as being reliable, knowledgeable sources. And if they identified additional species that they believed for various reasons were not appropriate, I pulled those out as well. So that was another 5 species. So you combine that with the 2 that I just discussed as case studies, and you end up with over 45% of the taxa within this petition probably were not appropriate for proposing. And so sort of transitioning to conclusions, I know I'm running a little short on time. So I would argue that this is, granted it's just from one mega-petition, so it's hard to generalize this across the mega-petition landscape, but at least in this petition, I think there's very clear evidence that the federal ban on mega-petitions is something that's warranted, and it's actually an evidence-based conclusion. So to conclude that this restriction was based on right-wing myths, I think at least in the case of this petition, is not something that's a supportable claim. And so one of the big recommendations that I would sort of take away from this study, and that jumped out to me personally at least, was the need for really a much stronger collaborative and consultation relationship between petitioners and recognized species authorities and state wildlife agencies. So despite the fact that a lot of these petitions do have, experts in the field of conservation that co-sign these petitions, often those experts are not actually experts in the specific species being proposed for listing. So for instance, in the mega-petition for the reptiles and amphibians, Edward O. Wilson was a co-signer of that petition. Obviously a huge name in the conservation field, but he is an ant specialist, not a reptile and amphibian specialist. So. So I think we need to actually have a much closer relationship between the people who actually have the knowledge and the data associated with these species, so that can then inform more effective and more efficient listing of species. And I think that's important, particularly in the current political landscape in Washington, because I think if we can minimize any critiques of the Endangered Species Act in terms of its inefficiency, that would be a good thing for all parties involved. And so I think being able to focus on the best available science, which is what the Fish and Wildlife Service is mandated to use as its criterion for recognizing or accepting species petitions, I think as petitioners also should be striving to uphold that standard if their goal is actually to have success in listing the species that they're petitioning. So with that, I will stop. Sorry, I went a little long, but thanks.